Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Operationalizing Network Evidence for Meaningful Outcomes, sponsored by Secureworks and Corelight. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Kevin Kerber, MSSP Director at Corelight, Alex Kirk, Global Principal at Corelight, and TJ Nelson, Director of Threat Research at Secureworks. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to spend the first 5 minutes framing our discussion today, and I couldn't think of a better way to frame the discussion than a quote from the first chapter of a book, Tau on Network Security, written by Richard Bailey. This quote frames perfectly what we'll be discussing today, which is essentially the importance of evidence to security operations teams, and the importance then of the right systems and people to leverage that evidence for meaningful outcomes. Next, Alex. When we collect evidence, this is the typical SOC triad that has become a popular phrase today. We're collecting evidence from network, we're collecting evidence from endpoint, we're collecting evidence from intel feeds or third parties or friendly intel, and we're feeding it into an analysis platform. Today, most organizations have this triad established. What we're going to present today is a view of this triad to suggest that there are a couple things that we need to consider to enhance and modify this triad for better, meaningful outcomes. The first is to discuss why the importance of network evidence. On my next slide, we're going to take a look at endpoint. What we've discovered is endpoint is critically important. It's not the holy grail. There are systems we cannot load endpoint on. There are TTPs that bypass endpoints. So endpoint, while critically important and a big investment we've all made, it's not the end all to be all. Look no further than the last 4 years of one of my favorite annual podcasts, John Strand's Tipping the Cash Cow. Black Hills Information Security has done a great job of identifying how important endpoint is, but all of the areas where additional evidence is needed because endpoint cannot catch everything. So pull that up. I highly recommend it. It frames why we're talking about what we're talking about today. Beyond endpoint, let's talk about network data. Most of you have a SIM. We will have network evidence. Why look into better metadata? The evidence collected in most device health logs were not designed for blue to catch red. I like to joke these dogs just weren't meant to hunt, right? These logs were designed for system administrators to determine the health and fidelity of network performance. NetFlow is designed to tell you if you're flapping an interface on your router, if your voice packet has the right DHCP marking and is hitting the right QoS bucket. It was not designed to tell you if there is an automated keystroke entry doing password guessing on SSH sessions, or worse, a successful auth after a bunch of password guessing. So what we're talking about today is a slightly different approach to what is providing my network evidence and how I'm analyzing it. Next slide, Alex. So the importance of network evidence shouldn't need to be debated anymore, but it still sort of is. It's encrypted, it can't run. Why is it important? Not enough organizations know their networks intimately and feed their evidence into systems that really do a great job of managing and analyzing that network evidence. And as Rob Joyce, who was former head of our tailored access operations in the United States, pointed out, you better know your network because we're going to. And his biggest fear was somebody who was passively monitoring, so he had no idea that they were there monitoring, and that monitoring was being observed and recorded and accessed by people. And when that wasn't in place, they succeeded. When that was in place, they had challenging succeeding their goal, which was to gain persistent access to systems. Next slide, Alex. And evidence of what can be done, proof in the pudding, collecting network evidence without judgment of good or bad was critical in Sunburst. Here's a meaningful quote from Scott Runnels at Manny at FireEye at the time. There was no detection from firewalls, even from Corelate. What there was Corelate collected evidence. And during the investigation, that historical evidence provided the information that allowed the TTPs and the IOCs to be shared globally. And then anybody with historical evidence could use that to determine if they were vulnerable. Just a great validation of our discussion today. Monitored network in the right hands of good people with the right systems. Alex, next slide. So let's talk about the systems themselves. So many systems where we place our evidence are focused on cosmetics, or were never really designed from the start as security systems. I won't name them by name, but many of the SIMs out there, security is an add-on. It was never designed originally for SOCs and for threat hunters and for incident responders. It became something it was used for. Putting the system and your evidence together, the right evidence in the right system matters. And that's what we're going to hit on later with Tejus. Alex? So let's put it into an analogy. Unstructured data in my SIM that is the wrong place is just a pile of Legos. That's all it is. Sitting, I don't have the right parts, I don't have the right colors. How do I know what's in here? I search for hours for that right piece that I needed to complete my project. What we're going to talk about is an approach that takes another step. Alex, next slide. We're going to talk about a system, Corelight, that structures. It doesn't provide you just evidence, it provides you the right evidence. And it provides you all those right pieces, curated for 25 years by an entire community of people. Next slide, Alex. We then take that evidence and we organize it, we structure it so that in your system, in the right hands, it is easily accessible. You know what code you need, you know what part you need, you know where it is. When you ask a question of the evidence, it's right there. You're not jumping to a different system. And then we talk about people in the hands of the right people. This is one of the leading organizations for decades at this point in security, and a system used by them provided as an opportunity now for you. So the right evidence in the right system, given the right hands. What we're going to do today, Alex, next slide, is for all attendees today, we're going to try to prove our point of the right evidence in the right hands with the right instructions. We'll be giving this away today. It is over a 3,000 piece, 3-foot long helocraft from Avengers, and we'll be providing that to help validate our point. That's it for my piece. Now we're going to turn it over from the high level overview into the technical. Alex, all you.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So to give people an idea of the sort of the problem with some of the data that is in those SIMs today and how it's being operationalized, I want to think a little bit about the math of the alerts that are coming out of their security systems. So according to the 2019 SANS SOC survey, the average SOC is getting something on the order of 10,000 alerts per day coming in. And that SOC is going to be staffed typically by somewhere between 2 and 10 analysts who are charged with actually reviewing those events and not just maintaining the systems that generate them in the first place. And if we think of humans as robots and we're going to pretend that they're perfectly productive for every single minute of a shift that they've got, you're still only left with 480 minutes in a normal 8-hour shift in a day. And in the scenario where you've got the high end of those number of analysts, there's those 10 folks going after 10,000 alerts, you're still in a position where you need to be resolving more than 2 alerts per minute in order to keep up with the flow of data that's coming through. And of course, the reality that we find in the wild is that it's typically considerably longer than a slightly less than 30-second window to get to any kind of resolution on any sort of an event. And the reason for that is, as Kevin alluded to, a lot of the data that is necessary in order to understand the scope of and triage these alerts is strewn about the average SIM in such a way that it's incredibly difficult to access. Now, Corelight has specifically taken Suricata and Zeek and brought them together on our devices to enable very quick access to the telemetry that's necessary to deal with the alerts that are coming out of something like Suricata. As a particular example here, we take an alert for a SQL injection against a web server, common across any organization that runs a web server farm, and the sort of event that you're likely to get potentially thousands of at any given point in time. Now, because we're able to take the unique identifier that is laid down on a per connection basis by Zeek and extend that directly into the Suricata logs, we can then pivot from one to the other with that direct key and be able to see things like, all right, all of those SQL injection attacks came back as a 404 because the module of WordPress or whatever other piece of software that had that vulnerability in it simply isn't present on that box, and it's just more of the scattershot bot activity that crosses the internet and clogs up our security tooling so frequently. And taking that kind of a step further, there's always the difficulty of figuring out when an alert is raised, whether or not an asset actually is vulnerable. So a prime example of that would be that, say you've got an alert that is designated as something that can attack Apache web servers, but the target that is being hit by that attack is an IIS server on the far side. Well, at that point, you don't really care, and you can go ahead and throw that event into the trash and continue moving along through the giant queue that you're attempting to get through. But if you actually are able to line that box up and say, I know that that is an Apache box, and I know that it is that vulnerable to that CVE, then that is an immediate red flag that you want to toss up and suddenly prioritize that event. And thus, it's the combination of those two pieces of data that gives you something actually useful that can move your priorities forward, as opposed to the disparate pieces of junk that are going to be difficult to access to get to that same conclusion. Now, of course, one of the things that this process leads to is automation of a lot of these quick correlations of data. And that's something that Corelight has gone out and done specifically with the good folks over at Splunk Phantom. And we've published this and a couple of other playbooks up on our GitHub. But to give you an example of the power of having that data in an easily structured and accessible way, let me speak briefly to this playbook that deals with alerts off of queries for a potentially suspect domain name. Because we've got everything that happened on the network, when that alert shows up, it's very easy to say, all right, let me query the DNS logs and find out for that particular malicious query, were any IP addresses actually returned by the DNS server, or did it all come back NX domain? Were connections actually made to those returned IP addresses, and were bytes actually transferred on them, or was it choked off by a firewall or other device along the way? And in the event that a successful connection is made, we're able to then pull out one set of indicators for HTTP. So your URI, your user agent string, the MIME type of the file that came back, etc. If something is occurring over SSL, there's an entirely different set of indicators that we can bring forward to the analyst. So the SSL subject and its validation status and its JA3, and you have it. It's easy to then take files that come down across the wire and put them directly into a system like a VirusTotal to figure out exactly what type of file we have on our hands if something is malicious. And then to even dive back into additional Suricata alerts that might have been generated on this resultant stream to be able to not only increase the confidence that the initial hit on that domain was indeed malicious, but to group all those activities together and really, again, accelerate the process of being able to make them operational and do something useful with them. Now, the further idea that is particularly interesting, I think, to folks is if we're pulling in data as Corelight from a vulnerability management system like a Tenable in order to enable this CVE correlation, it's very easy for us to then say, hey, we as Corelight have found an asset that is on the protected network that is not listed in the vulnerability management system, and put that information back in to a scheduled scan or whatever the policy might dictate to allow you to get a better understanding of your environment as an automated process, including not only a loop back from Corelight into the vulnerability management system, but from a system like a Tenable into a CMDB like ServiceNow, as well as with data from that CMDB enriching the logs in Corelight to be able to tell you, this isn't just this IP address, but it's owned by this organization, this department, it's part of this building, to, again, really enrich all of the data that you have and put those pieces into a place that they can be very rapidly acted on and built into something meaningful. Now, a lot of the concepts that we're talking about here sound very basic and fundamental, especially when Kevin talks about the SOC triad and 3 sources of data. It sounds like it's something really easy to do. And so the question kind of becomes, why have so many organizations failed to be able to actually implement this in the real world? And to Kevin's point earlier, not only are these pieces of data coming in from a variety of systems and a variety of different formats that needs to be normalized and made operational together, but the administrative overhead of having to touch application servers, network devices, endpoint, security, and maintain all of those data feeds into that central normalized whole is an entire process that a lot of organizations don't account for on their own. And so it's very easy to have a system admin come along and turn down the verbosity of logging on the firewall to save CPU and then end up with a giant blind spot. That is, of course, also assuming that the data is there in the first place. To Kevin's earlier point about the design of logs, speaking to DNS in particular, if you are logging that off of your Active Directory or bind servers, which are some of the most common places to pull that data from, you're not going to actually get the answers to the queries that were made returned in those logs. And if you're trying to conduct an investigation like I showed with that playbook a moment ago, having that gap is going to make it exceptionally difficult for you to get the information you need to move forward to a reasonable operational decision. And therefore, that's why it's so important to consolidate the sources of data, the sources of truth that are bringing you the information into your central repository so that you can manage them and be able to flow through them in a reasonable fashion that gives you the speed you need to keep up with attackers on the internet.
And that's where we'll make the transition. So we go back. So, what we just presented was obviously a message of monitoring your networks for meaningful outcomes. The first step is to get from this unstructured, uncorrelated data that was never meant for the goal you're trying to achieve. And let's take the first step, which is to implement a sensor that structures that data and provides you the evidence you want. Evidence designed for security operations. The next step is to organize that into a system and then have it backed by the right people. That's where we're stepping now, is we're going to discuss having it in the right system with the type of instructions and rules and guidance so that you can create meaningful outcomes with the data that you've provided. So we'll turn over to TJ now to talk through that piece.
Yeah, it looks like, there we go. So the question you may be having right now is, who is Secureworks and how are we leveraging the network evidence provided by Corelate in our Tagis platform? Secureworks provides complete cybersecurity solutions featuring our Tagis cloud-native security operations and analytics platform and derivative software service XDR, managed XDR, and VDR offerings supported by our professional services. Plus, we offer incident response, adversarial testing, and security advisory services. So the question is, why did we develop Tagis in the platform? Well, as customer IT infrastructure and the threat landscape became increasingly complex, we found security tools available on the market today were lacking in the needed capabilities such as comprehensive visibility and the ability to analyze telemetry from multiple sources. So we leveraged our extensive experience running the global security operations centers and largely our firsthand knowledge on the threat landscape to create Tagis, a massively scalable cloud-native security operations and analytics platform that our experts now use to defend our customers. Tagis has been battle tested in a variety of global cyber attacks, including, among others, Sunburst backdoor, Supernova malware, the Microsoft Exchange zero-day vulnerability, and even ransomware attacks such as Revil and Ryuk. Tagis helps Secureworks defend over 5,000 global organizations day in and day out today. Our original vision for Tagis spanned beyond Secureworks internal teams. We wanted customers and partners to take advantage of our expertise, knowledge, technology, threat research, and best practices to protect themselves. So today, Tagis is the heart of security operations at organizations all over the world. So having a holistic view of the IT infrastructure is key to security efficacy. Analysts gain a single pane of glass view in control over their attack surface with the Tagis platform. And it does this by aggregating signals from network, cloud, and endpoint, and your other existing security tools with vulnerability data and threat intelligence mixed in. This is where our partners, such as Corelate, come into play here. With them, we can correlate threat intelligence, vulnerability data, logs, events from different security tools, and validate and prioritize those alerts. As a result, analysts spend less time dealing with false positives and can get to the real issue sooner. This means that we can jump right into investigating what really matters here. Tagis collects from across your environment and incorporates a comprehensive threat hunting toolkit, including the MITRE ATT&CK TTPs. Accordingly, your analysts will have a holistic view of your security infrastructure and can perform all investigations within the platform without having to manually stitch together data or bounce between security tools. All of your endpoint data, your network data, and your cloud data will be in one place, allowing analysts to threat hunt quickly and effectively. Lastly, the Tagis connectors enable actions to be performed via the security network environment and tools. All of these mean that the analyst can respond drastically faster to incidents and reduce their mean time to response. So where does Corelate fit in this picture? Well, securing today's complex environments requires collecting and correlating evidence across endpoint, especially network, and cloud. By combining the automated security analytics and threat detection capabilities of Tagis XDR through their detectors with the session-level network telemetry from Corelate, analysts can actually save time during investigations by having a single pane of view on endpoint, network, and cloud, fill endpoint visibility gaps with the superior threat detection and network detection and response evidence from Corelate, and as also reduce blind spots with strong network evidence, even seeing better into the DNS and encrypted traffic data that comes across your network. These detectors that we're talking about are continuously updated with threat indicators, countermeasures, and purpose-built analytics from our Secureworks counter threat unit. Today, Tagis leverages over billions of events to detect, understand, and stop sophisticated attacks. Now that you have a little background on how Tagis and Corelate work better together, let's go to my colleague Frank, who can show you what that looks like from an analyst point of view.
Hello. Today I will be providing you all a demo on how having the right evidence and the right tooling can drive a better and quicker security outcome. Let me show you an example. On my screen here, I have our Tagis Alert Triage dashboard. I'd like to bring your attention to the Critical Alerts widget here. With alert fatigue being a real problem with many security operations centers, this widget allows us to zero in on what we should be reviewing first. Looking at the timestamps, it seems that all these alerts may be related to the same investigation. However, we need evidence to support that. Here, we see a critical alert indicating privilege escalation on Acme Desktop 1 at IP address 172.16.11.20. This type of privilege escalation is very popular within the Metasploit framework. Now, let's see if we can find additional artifacts on this endpoint by pivoting to the host. Here, we can identify an additional privilege escalation alert, as well as lower severity alerts, such as ping sweep, disabling Windows Defender, enumerating the sensitive LSAS process, and even an alert indicating communication to a DGA domain. Let's go ahead and add all these alerts to my investigation. And at this point, we can identify that something nefarious is going on this endpoint. So we're going to also want to isolate it too. Now, let's go back to the alert triage dashboard. And we still have these two additional critical alerts. Let's take a look at this copying Active Directory database. Looking at the alert description, it looks like we are identifying a process that is associated with copying the AD database. Now let's see if we can find any other interesting artifacts on this Acme domain controller at 172.16.11.11. Scrolling down to the related alerts section, we can see that we have our current alerts that we are reviewing about copying the Active Directory database, but we also have some additional alerts. And here, it seems like it's possible that both Acme Desktop 1 and this Acme domain controller are involved in the same investigation because we're seeing similar activity occur on both. Let's go ahead and add these to our investigation as well. So at this point, we have a lot of endpoint telemetry indicating malicious activity. But if we utilize our NDR telemetry, we can connect more dots. So let's go ahead and do a quick search on Acme Desktop 1 at IP address 172.16.11.20. Here, we have additional supporting evidence that we are seeing an active Metasploit executable on our Acme Desktop 1 here. As well, we've seen an alert indicating a successful RDP brute force attack between Acme Desktop 1 and our domain controller. Let's go ahead and add all these Corelight alerts to our investigation. Now, let's see what a completed investigation looks like. Once you go to the investigation, you'll be presented with the key findings section. The key findings section is a great place for SecOps teams to keep notes during the full investigation timeline. Next, we'll go to the Events tab here. The Events section are all the raw telemetry that you can pull into an investigation for historical purposes. Now, there may be times where there's a lot of data. For example, a brute force attack or all the net flow activity. You may not want to capture all of those individual pieces of artifacts into one investigation. So what you can do is add those search queries to your investigation. This allows for historical tracking and for better root cause analysis, since you have all the data at your fingertips in one section of the Tagis XDR platform. As you can see here at the bottom, we're collecting all the net flow activity that we saw during that time frame. And lastly, we have all the events that were added throughout the build out. Thank you for taking some time today for us to show you how having the right evidence and the right tooling can allow for a quicker and better security outcome.
So with that, we're going to talk about a little bit of a giveaway today. For everyone who registered, we'll be selecting an individual and doing a random drawing and shipping this to you. We'll be reaching out to you to get an address to ship to. We are going to be providing a Marvel Superheroes helicarrier. This is no small Lego kit, but it reinforces our message. And the message very simply is, without the right pieces, our outcomes are not achievable. Even with the right pieces, it's not achievable if we don't have the instructions of what to do with them. If you notice during the demonstration, there was a tremendous amount of insight provided about the event that didn't require your end analyst to have to put those pieces together on their own. It was stitched together and then supported by the right individuals, whether it's the customer success team at Corelate or it's the extensive experience of Secureworks delivering security outcomes and now extending the platform that they leverage for individuals to use in their environment. So we'll be sending this out after. I think at this stage, our next step is to jump into questions we might have and finish the webinar with the Q&A session.
All right, thanks for that presentation. We do have some questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for our presenters, please enter it into the questions window now. The first one asks, how does Zeek compare to NetFlow?
So I'll go ahead and take that one. The data that is provided out of Corelight using that open source Zeek engine is considerably more detailed than NetFlow in that it is fully layer 7 aware and extracts a great deal of forensics-oriented metadata from those layer 7 protocols that ride on top of the IP layer that is sort of the space of traditional NetFlow. The other big differentiator is that NetFlow is often sampled in large environments, whereas the Corelight data is designed to be a one-for-one mapping of everything that has happened on the network with no sampling necessary.
Thanks, Alex. I think the other key point is NetFlow was designed for network performance, and Corelate and Zeek was designed for security metadata. And so the library that we're providing is enhanced week after week by both Corelate's research team and a global community of federal agencies and private organizations saying this additional evidence would have been really helpful if it was provided to me. So it's the difference between a fixed set of fields and this extensible language that allows us to enhance this library, which is why it's as relevant today as it was 25 years ago when it was first used in one of our national labs.
All right, thank you. The next, did someone have something more to add? All right, next one. If Corelate/Zeek can be used to find sunburst IOCs, can it also help find the Chinese state TTPs that the CISA recently published?
Yes, so actually in particular, we've published a document up on corelate.blog that actually maps out which of those TTPs we can specifically detect, as well as provides granular level signature detail about which Suricata signatures go up against the specific vulnerabilities that were outlined as part of that document. So, I think that particular document too is very relevant to a new strategy that we're seeing coming out of this administration. After the cyber executive order, there's been that document releasing, in sort of an unprecedented way, a breakdown of what the adversaries are doing. There are ransomware working groups that are being formed. There's a lot more focus on collaboration between public and private defenders. And I think it really speaks to the fact that, we all as defenders need to be operating off of the same playbook, running together using the same techniques and the same structure to get after our goals in a way that a lot of attackers have been for some time on that offensive end of things.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, TJ, because Tejus maps to MITRE, which is just so wonderfully structured, and all of those things that were released were mapped to that framework, weren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And, when we talk about dwell time and some of these attacks that we're finding out after the fact, it's really important to understand that evidentiary data that's provided by Corelate and, is available in Tagis allows you to go and interrogate your systems and infrastructure after the fact to see if you were affected. As we're understanding these attacks and our threat research team is working throughout day and night to try to understand and identify and put a spotlight on the adversary, we're taking that knowledge and then interrogating our customer environments to make sure that were you affected? If so, when and how? And so having that evidentiary data to really fall back on and really get the full understanding of what was going on, even after the fact, is really important as we, have these large attacks that have been happening over the past couple months.
All right, thanks. What about encrypted traffic? Does this require decryption?
I love that question because it means you're understanding what we just presented. So that's a great question. It doesn't require decryption. However, if you can decrypt, it's helpful. But what's really important is that one of the benefits of this approach is to understand that if I cannot decrypt, what else can I learn? There are so many things we can identify in the behavior of an encrypted session. One was provided by Salesforce.com when they released the JA3 script, which was a way to fingerprint SSL sessions. Another example is to identify that we can tell the difference between a human and an automated keystroke. We can tell the difference between a password guess and a successful authentication. So there are so many things that can be identified about an encrypted session that can map to the TTPs that TJ just mentioned, and how those approaches would suggest that this behavior would only be used if that approach was occurring. So when you can decrypt, it is tremendously beneficial. When you can't decrypt, there's still so much value, and the community continues to add to that month in and month out for the additional things we can find about encrypted sessions.
All right, thanks. Someone says, thanks, I'm getting to know the tool and learning. Our next question asks, what kind of detections can Tagus, I think I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, Tagis, perform using Corelate evidence?
So we actually leverage the full breadth of Corelate's evidence data in order to impact our customers with our threat intelligence. So when it comes to direct indicators, we can sort of pull out segments. So DNS, domain names, IP addresses, net flow activity, we can identify that, saying this is attributed to a known adversary, and we're currently tracking that. We can look at some of the data that's getting pulled in from flow, and as you could see in the demonstration, the RDP data, to understand the pathways the adversary has had within our environment, and we can leverage some of our analytics detectors to identify anomalous activity that may not have been, visible if an analyst was looking at a bunch of our DNS logs or RDP logs and things along those lines. We can sort of leverage our expertise in this area and the power of analytics to sort of identify that activity that's most likely going to be malicious and needs to be looked at with a closer eye versus, the wall of logs that we're inundated with today in most security infrastructures.
Well, and I think, TJ, that really speaks to the value of having comprehensive data, because you can enable so many different classes of analytics on top of, not only the network data on its own, but the combination of the network and the endpoint. The question really kind of becomes, what sort of detection could you not pursue at the point where you had all that centralized into that coherent whole where you can kind of quickly grab the data you need for analytics.
Yeah, that's how Legos work, is the pieces come together in many different shapes and forms. You can get a Lego set and make it into something completely different that's functional and usable for your application. And I think that's what evidentiary data provides us, is if you have the right context and the information, you can sort of cut and slice that data to make sure that it gives you the response and results that you're looking for.
Yeah, and if there's of interest, we've published threat hunting guides. Our blog post with our research team has shown all types of vulnerabilities and IOCs and TTPs, from the ones recently released regarding the Chinese state actors to Metasploit to Ripple 20. These are examples of the things that you can identify in Tagis with our evidence. And if you go to our websites, there are plenty of examples of the things you can expose with the right evidence.
All right, thanks. That's all the questions I'm seeing for today. Does anyone have any closing thoughts they'd like to share?
I'll just wrap by saying this is meaningful. This is leveraged by many organizations, and it makes outcomes different. Too many times we enter investigations and we provide the statement of closed, not enough evidence. I ask a question of my evidence and I don't get a response that progresses my investigation. I get a response that slows my investigation down. That's what the combination of these technologies is designed to result. I'll wrap with a story. I went to Legoland with my sons, and one of them sat this big pile of Legos and he made a Kansas City Chiefs helmet. And he spent 3 hours, but it was awesome. He found all the red pieces, all the white pieces, all the right ones that fit. 3 hours, but he made a helmet. My other son sat in front of these pile of Legos and he just wanted to make the letter C in his favorite color, green. And after 20 minutes, he left and he went and played on the playground. We've got to stop that second thing from happening. We've got to prevent that first activity from taking us 3.5 hours. That's what we're suggesting is available to us. I'll wrap with Richard Balick's quote again: the right evidence in the right systems at the hands of the right people results in meaningful outcomes. Thanks for your time today. And Carol, we'll wrap with that.
Thanks all.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin, Alex, and TJ, for your great presentation, and to Secureworks and Corelight for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.